us to just jump in? Perfect. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Christa, and I am with Project Protect Our Children. I serve as the Director of Operations. I have two amazing co-presenters today. We've all worked on this together, and they are brilliant women with so much passion for this work. And we are just so excited to share our experience, this information with you guys. So I'm going to let these other two ladies introduce themselves. Davina, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Davina, and I am the Executive Director and a business coach for Micreate, which is a nonprofit that works with survivors of trafficking to start businesses around their advocacy work, and in the prevention field, working with youth and getting some work training, trade training, and start micro businesses.
And I'm Amanda Elkanick Oder. I'm the Chief Advocacy and Education Officer at the Texas Advocacy Project. And we are a statewide nonprofit agency that provides free legal services and social services exclusively to survivors.
Awesome. So if you're just joining us, welcome. This presentation really is designed for those that are working in this space. If you're new here, if you're not super familiar with the concept of trafficking, or maybe you are in a trafficking adjacent field and now you're part of the coalition and you want to be plugged into the greater movement. Today, we want to unpack what human trafficking is and make it as super practical and applicable as possible. Just real life examples, real life scenarios. And then talk about, what are some best practices as you communicate about human trafficking, as you serve people who have been trafficked? What are some things to keep in mind as you enter and do your beautiful work in this space? So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump in and talk about what human trafficking is. And Amanda will take this.
Yeah, I will take this part. It would be really helpful for me if y'all could chat in the organizations that y'all work for. And I kind of like to start presentations that I'm doing by saying, like, when you saw the announcement for this training that came out, was there something that before you even joined, you were like, I have this specific type of question, or I need clarity around this specific issue, and I'm hoping to get that by the time that this presentation ends. Like Christa said, we really want for this to be engaging and useful so that you can get tools and take them back into your community. And so if you came into this space today with like, I have this specific question and I hope that this presentation answers it, please also put that in the chat, because that will help. If we don't have it like specifically in here, between the three of us, we'll try to answer those questions or be able to direct you to the resources that can get those types of questions answered. So that's really helpful for us kind of as we guide through this conversation and this afternoon together. We're not going to spend a like super ton of time on all the federal definitions and things like that, because we really want to try to break it down into what it actually looks like practically when we're working with survivors. But it is very helpful as we are working with survivors to understand what are the definitions, what are our federal definitions, how long have they been around, what types of protections are available to survivors. So the first screen that you see is this, what we call, because we love acronyms in this work, right, is TVPA, is what you might have heard it referred to as in the past, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This was first enacted in 2000. You see that on your screen also. If you try to go and look at TVPA and get through all of the information, which I know Davina has because she's an attorney also, and so she's like in those laws and in that federal legislation, there's a lot of words in there. So we're going to break them down for you. This bill has been reauthorized 5 times since 2000. The most recent was in 2019. They tried to get it reauthorized last year or the year before, and it was only partially reauthorized. So there were pieces that we were hoping to expand. Anytime we're reauthorizing a federal bill, it's to provide more resources to community organizations, right? Whether that's like funding, which we need, whether that's like mandates to certain people who need to receive trainings, like law enforcement officers or judges or healthcare workers. So that what's important to know about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is there's really 3 prongs that are built into this act. And they all start with P's because I love a good alliteration, okay? So you've got prevention, prosecution, and protection. And in Texas, we really focus a lot of our resources here and are funneled through trying to prosecute traffickers. And what you'll hear throughout our presentation today is that that's not always the #1 goal for a survivor, is the prosecution of that trafficker. It could look like other things, like trying to get coerced debt off of their credit report so that they can get into housing or get better jobs. It can look like an expunction of their criminal record so that they can, again, get housing and better jobs and have sustainable living situations. And so this 3-pronged approach that the Texas Victim Protection Act offers, we really want to try to explore all of those prongs today holistically as we're working with survivors. You see some different definitions of how the TVPA, Texas, or lots of T's, Trafficking Victims Protection Act defines human trafficking broadly, and then sex trafficking, and then labor trafficking. We try to break it down into more simple terms. So you see human trafficking on your screen right here, the crime of inducing or compelling a person to engage in commercial sex or to provide labor or services. Sex trafficking, oftentimes when we think of trafficking, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir, most likely, right? Is we think of trafficking when somebody says human trafficking in terms of sex trafficking. It's important to know that here in Texas, we rank #3 in the nation for labor trafficking and #2 in the nation for sex trafficking. So we have big numbers here. We are also a very big state. So we need lots of resources to accompany survivors, and also how survivors identify, right? Human trafficking survivors, when we use the words like controlling tactics of force, fraud, or coercion, like what does that even mean? And then when you're saying like forced labor, what does that actually look like? And in a couple of slides down, we're going to break down what force, what fraud, and what coercion can actually look like for survivors. So when you're like screening, or maybe you're working with somebody and they start saying things like, oh, I was working at a bar and my employer told me that they were going to just pay me under the table and they were going to pay me, $5 for every hour that I worked, but then I was actually only getting $2 an hour. These are things that you're going to be listening for, because they're going to be red flags that this could be a trafficking case and can open up a lot of other resources and organizations that you can connect those survivors with. Did I miss anything, Christa or Davina, on that you guys want to cover?
No, that's awesome. I think we can just kind of again, I know that most people in this space are probably familiar with the concept of human trafficking, but just kind of running through some of these definitions. So this TVPA, written in the year 2000, basically is what makes human trafficking a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And like Amanda's talked about, there's those 3 prongs in this. I don't know how many pages this bill is. It's very long. But that just means that written into this law are these 3 areas that we're trying to legally come at this issue of human trafficking. But the definitions outlaid in this bill are that human trafficking is the crime of inducing or compelling a person to engage in commercial sex or provide labor or services. And notice that there's no need for transportation in the definition of trafficking. So a lot of times people think human trafficking is taking someone across a border, or they think about human trafficking in the buying and selling of people realm, but they think about it in terms of transporting them from one country to another. So it literally just means compelling or inducing a person to work or perform a service. And that definition of sex trafficking just means that someone is compelled to engage in commercial sex through these control tactics, force, fraud, and coercion, which we'll break down in a second. But when we're looking at any case of human trafficking, we want to look at it like a story, because most crimes are like an equation, right? This isn't mine, I take it, I stole it. Like it's all one and done. You can see exactly the moment that that crime happened. You know exactly who's to blame. You know exactly who, the victim was of this crime. It's all very clear. But in trafficking, because of the nature of all of the elements that this bill says makes up a case, those don't all happen in a moment. They can happen over a period of a year. So then we really have to step back and ask, okay, this person is working on the streets. This person is engaged in commercial sex. Why are they there? This person is in a job that's that's a bad situation, but why are they in this job? And what we're looking for is how they got there. Were they compelled? Did someone control them? And then the bill outlines the ways we classify control are force, fraud, and coercion, which is, we'll break down more later, but that physical control, lying to someone, threatening, blackmailing. And so whether you're engaged in commercial sex or you're working a job, if someone controlled you to get there, that's human trafficking. Now, you might be ahead of the curve and going, well, wait, isn't prostitution illegal? And yes, it is. So what differentiates sex trafficking from prostitution or sex work is that compelled piece, that there was somebody else pulling the strings. There was somebody else who got you into that situation, who landed you there, or who kept you there. That obviously gets really sticky. And so, as Amanda mentioned, there were these layers and protections onto this original bill. And one of them was a protection for minors that says any person under the age of 18 exchanging sex for anything of value, a sex act of any kind for anything of value, has been trafficked. So we're not asking the questions, well, were you forced into it? How'd you get here? Like, you're a kid, this shouldn't have happened to you, and we're protecting you. So that's just kind of, again, just like fleshing out these definitions of what trafficking is a little bit, and kind of giving us some of that legwork. Davina, what are your thoughts? Any comments?
Yes. So definitely a couple of thoughts, especially, and I'm going to move backward from the last thing you said and then other thoughts. So when we are talking about minor sex trafficking, another piece is that minors generally cannot consent to sex. And so that's also a legal consideration into why we kind of automatically say, anybody that is benefiting from sex acts of a minor, we just call that trafficking. And then I also wanted to mention, sometimes when we're looking at situations and we're weighing what's actually going on, there's a spectrum, right? From exploitation all the way down to trafficking. There are times where people are being exploited, but they are not being trafficked because that compelled piece that Christa really underlined is not there. And so you may see someone who says, well, I haven't been paid what I was supposed to be paid, and I really can't quit this job right now because I don't feel like I have other opportunities. And we have to discern, well, is that person being compelled by some outside person or individual, or individuals to force them into that situation, or is it just a tough place that they're in? So I definitely wanted to highlight some of those differences. And yeah, I think those were all my thoughts.
Yeah. And as you kind of, as we break down this framework of what a case of trafficking is, you can then again lay this framework on the stories that you're encountering and go, okay, are all of the elements here? Are they in play? So let's talk about what this looks like here in Texas. As Amanda mentioned, we've got we rank pretty high. So Amanda, can you break down what this is looking like here in our state?
Yeah, and I'd love for Davina to kind of step into, because she's also doing a lot of this work here in Texas. But what's important to understand is we just covered like the federal act on how our United States terms human trafficking and the crimes related to human trafficking. And human trafficking is illegal federally and in all 50 states. And it's important to note that because we have built our own legislation here in Texas, and every legislative session, we continue to add more language, We continue to add more recommendations and requirements for people who live and work here and have our professionals here. And then also in ways to protect survivors, so different types of protections that are available. So if I were to give you every single law that exists in Texas around human trafficking, it would be a huge page. But I just wanted to kind of hone in on the way that our state defines human trafficking, and you can find that, again, it's going to be buried in lots of legal jargon. You do not have to be the expert in legal jargon, because you've got 2 agencies on this call that's literally our whole job. So Davina that's her whole job. We've got 18 attorneys at TAP, that's their whole job. And so you don't have to be the knower of all this information, but it's really helpful to know the organizations that you can connect survivors with, so that we can decide, okay, where does this fit in the Texas statute? So what you'll find in the penal code is it defines in Texas sex trafficking, labor trafficking, child trafficking, and then even breaks it down further into forced labor, debt bondage, and domestic servitude. So each of these has its own very specific definition that is a lot in alignment with what we see federally as well. So when we're looking at these federal statutes and we're looking at these Texas statutes and we're working with survivors, we can help build these cases here in Texas, but then also see if there's any federal consequences to those actions too, I think is really helpful when we see that, again, that spectrum that we're looking for. Did you want to add anything to that, Davina?
Yes, and I'm sorry that I realized I didn't introduce myself fully at the beginning. I'm also an attorney. I work full-time with Lone Star Legal Aid's Justice for Human Trafficking Survivors program, and I do a lot of civil legal work specifically with survivors of all forms of human trafficking recognized here in Texas, which is labor and sex trafficking, as well as the other ones listed here. And I want to make sure that, when we're talking about the legal code, one thing I really have been seeing as a civil attorney, looking from the inside in to what criminal attorneys are doing, it's very important for civil attorneys to understand what is all going on when we're looking at trafficking cases. And so I'm going to broaden the scope a little bit outside of trafficking, because what we know about trafficking, there's a lot of intersectionalities. When a person is being trafficked, and this is just from the mouths of those with lived experience, overcomers and survivors, we know that they are forced to engage in many different types of acts. It could be from taking care of children all the way to writing fraudulent checks, taking the fall for drug possession and things like that. And so it's very important that we do have these layered abilities to bring charges against traffickers, so that we are capturing all of the different ways that they victimize folks, as well as this list here when it comes to trafficking. And so, if someone is being trafficked for both sex labor and for both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and we see that maybe the trafficking started when they were a child, and we see that there is some forced labor, let's layer on all of those charges, especially if there's long-term, times of the instance of trafficking. And then let's look at other crimes that the person was compelled to do. This is not only helpful in prosecuting traffickers, but in finding reprieve for survivors later on, for those who have drug possession charges, for those who have prostitution charges, theft charges, things like that, that may actually be a direct result of their instance of trafficking. So I know I kind of expanded a bit and went out of the scope of trafficking, but I also want to start to tingle in your mind all the ways that trafficking can affect a person's life. And it's not just, these definitions that we're looking at, but it really does touch many aspects of their life.
Yeah, one of the things I think Christa maybe be able to, you might want to speak to it a little bit more, is how often or how common we see familial trafficking. And then that intersectionality portion where Davina was just talking about, where even we see at Texas Advocacy Project, where we're serving victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking, in having those conversations, we have to specifically train all of our attorneys to be listening for certain things, because although a survivor might identify as a victim of intimate partner violence, and that might be why they're calling in, is to try to get maybe custody of their child or something like that. Through that conversation and that legal consult, we're hearing things that, oh, this really sounds also like a human trafficking case, but that's not how the survivor identifies as having experienced human trafficking. So that intersectionality portion is really important, especially if we're working outside of the scope and the organizations that you might be working for aren't only doing human trafficking work. You're going to hear that human trafficking exists in a lot of these survivors, and might have been trafficked from a family member, might have been trafficked by an abuser or their partner, somebody who they identify as their partner, who's also abusive to them and is also trafficking them. So we see the layers that Davina was just talking about in that.
Yeah. You know, the common thought or the common message around trafficking is that kidnapping or white van scenario. And I mean, you know, especially with, you know, films coming out recently, people are very sensitive and very incensed about, you know, people being kidnapped and snatched and, you know, snatched off the street and sold in some deep, dark alley somewhere where you'll never find them again. And the reality is that kidnapping is the least common way human trafficking happens. Most trafficking happens in relationships because human trafficking is a form of abuse, but it's abuse with a purpose. And so if abuse, as we know, mostly takes place in relationships, then it would follow that trafficking does as well. And we see that in the survivors' stories that we're listening to and working with. They were trafficked by someone they know and trusted. But again, what are those elements of a trafficking case? You were compelled to work, or you were compelled to engage in commercial sex. Well, how do you compel someone? The abuse that you can gain over someone, the control you can gain by abusing them, is how people are compelled. So what we hear are people that are in abusive situations or just in bad situations, and they know it. Like most of the time, they're very aware this is not a good situation. But they're not aware that what they're in is trafficking because it doesn't fit the mold that they've seen on social media. I wasn't kidnapped. I wasn't forced to do this. He just told me that if I didn't, then no one would love me and I'd have nowhere else to go. And I figured he was probably right. So here we are. Or, well, he's also the father of my child. And so what else am I going to do? Or, well, you know, she's my best friend and she let me stay with her when I didn't have another place to go. And she said that I owed her for that. And I figured she was probably right. So we're hearing that, you know, people are in these relationships that are super unhealthy. But what we want to be listening for as service providers is that, was that abuse then used for a purpose? Was this person just on a power trip? Are they just like mean-spirited? Or were they using that to gain some level of control to get you to engage in commercial sex or work in a job? And so Amanda and Davina kind of outlined like these types of trafficking, like sex trafficking, labor trafficking, but then these happen in certain arenas. So before I kind of talk about where we see trafficking happen and what those different elements can look like, do y'all have anything that you want to add to?
So we do have a question in the chat asking about the difference between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. And is it okay if I go ahead and begin answering that? And then I'm happy to have y'all chime in. So when we're talking about smuggling, and let me just handle the smuggling and then we can talk about migrant smuggling. When we're talking about smuggling, we're talking about the illegal, and that's the actual law, the illegal crossing of borders, of international borders. That's it. We see a lot of smuggling happening a lot. You know, let's think about Texas. We see a lot of folks helping others smuggle into, you know, one country to another, whether that's Canada, Mexico, whether it's Nicaragua into Venezuela. If you're not going through the channels that have been set up by that country's government, then that is considered smuggling. And this is a physical form of transportation.
Mhm.
When we're talking about migrant smuggling, then that would be the smuggling of people specifically to conduct migrant work. And so rather than getting the appropriate visas you need to enter into a country and conduct that migrant work, it would be, I'm going to go across the border and obtain work in this country. And there's a lot of reasons for smuggling, right? People want better opportunities. Some people are in a bad way at home, so they need to go somewhere else for safety. There's a lot of reasons why people are smuggled or engage in smuggling behavior. When we're talking about trafficking, we are discussing specifically making someone do work or engage in commercial sex for some kind of benefit. And so the difference would be smuggling, again, is that illegal crossing of international borders, whereas human trafficking is compelling someone to do some kind of labor or sex commercial act. We have seen where people have been trafficked while being smuggled, where maybe a smuggler is forcing someone to, carry everybody's packs, and if you don't do it, we're going to leave you behind. There's a dire consequence to, they're compelling the person to do work. So that is how we would define. Does that help, Selena?
Yes, thank you so much for clarifying that.
No problem. And Amanda, thank you so much for giving that definition. I'm dropping a definition of smuggling in Texas. So definitely feel free to use that.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Yeah, we see smuggling turn into trafficking. So, like Davina said, it could be that the smuggler says, hey, I'll help you cross the border for X amount of dollars. You get across the border and all of a sudden that number is double. And that person says, and this is how you're going to pay me back. You're going to work in X, Y, and Z. So those things can be really linked, but they're fundamentally separate issues.
Yeah.
So we've got these, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, child trafficking, all these things that are specifically written out in our penal code to say this situation is a crime, which means there's, punishment for the perpetrator. There's help for the person who has experienced this. So where do we see these crimes kind of unfold? In Texas, we have three main arenas that we see sex trafficking, and then labor trafficking can happen in literally any industry. But kind of these three main arenas are domestic trafficking. So that's Americans trafficked by Americans to Americans here. It just means you don't leave your country. You're just trafficked here. And then the commercial sexual exploitation of youth. So if you see those acronyms down below, DMST stands for domestic minor sex trafficking. That just means American young people trafficked by Americans to Americans here in America. And then another way that you could say that is also commercially sexually exploited youth, which again, it just refers to young people who are in those situations of trafficking. And so that's a huge area where we're seeing sex trafficking and child sex trafficking. And in that can be what Davina mentioned or Amanda mentioned as familial trafficking. So being trafficked by your family. And according to Polaris's latest report, Polaris Project runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they take stock and take data on every case that comes through their office. And of those cases, at their latest report, about 50% said they were trafficked by a family member. The next highest trafficker category was intimate partner or romantic partner. So again, we're seeing people trafficked by the people they know, love, and trust, who then take advantage of them. Familial trafficking can look a myriad of different ways. In some instances, it's generational. Grandma was trafficked, mom was trafficked, girls are trafficked. It's just what happens to the women in our family is kind of the narrative. Sometimes we see parents trafficking their kids for drugs. In a lot of these instances, a child might be experiencing abuse and not know that they're being trafficked. They might not know that their parent is getting a kickback for the abuse they're experiencing. So they think, oh, our apartment landlord is abusing me, and they don't know that that's how rent is getting paid this month. Or maybe they do know, and maybe, you know, the story they're told is, you're part of this family and, you know, we need your help. So familial trafficking can take so many different forms, but it is that trafficking by a family member. And again, anytime a minor is exchanging a sex act for something of value, whether they receive it or not, that is trafficking. So an example of where a minor would receive something, oftentimes youth, especially in our child welfare system, run away. And when they're out on the street, they get on social media and they write a message, hey, I'm looking for a place to stay tonight. They connect with somebody who says, hey, you can come stay with me. And then when they get there, they are told, well, if you want to stay here, or, you know, I bought you Whataburger, so you owe me this sexual favor. So this child engaged in a sex act, and they were the recipient of the thing of value, whatever that was. But they were trafficked because they're a minor. So for children especially, we don't need to see that third party controller. We just need to know, did that child exchange a sex act, and then something of value was given in exchange, whether they received it or someone else received it. That's child trafficking. A lot of this happens on social media and the internet. Any place where two people can have a conversation, you can arrange a time, a place, and a dollar amount and agree to meet up. But you can be trafficked and never leave your bedroom if you are sending pictures or videos to someone who is asking for those things, and maybe buying the soccer cleats that you couldn't afford so you can play on the team. Or they are then turning around and selling those pictures and videos. That child could be trafficked, and they've literally never met a person, never physically touched a person, but they're being trafficked over the internet. So we're seeing that domestic minor, or CSA trafficking, happen in a lot of different forms. But again, no matter what the scenario is, we're listening for, did that child engage in a commercial sex act and something of value was exchanged? Do you have any other comments on that before we kind of get into the IMBs?
I just wanted to mention that part of the federal definition and Texas Penal Code also is that a person receiving a benefit, even if it's not the person that's specifically controlling the victim, can also be considered a trafficker. And so the simplest way we can think of this is, we have a person who's acting like a manager of sexual exploitation, so maybe like a pimp or something like that. And they are forcing having a child, a minor, engage in a commercial sex act. The person receiving the commercial sex act, not the pimp, the person receiving the commercial sex act will also be considered a trafficker of that child, along with the pimp. And so I just, and if it's an adult person, and say there's a pimp that's forcing a person to engage in a commercial sex act, the other person who's paying for the commercial sex act could also be considered a trafficker per our laws. So I just also wanted to make sure that when we're saying someone is receiving a benefit, and knowingly receiving a benefit, then we'll be able to, if we're able to prove that knowingly, then we'd be able to also have them be charged with trafficking.
And maybe one of you guys could speak to this. In our last legislative session, correct me if I'm just like really off my rocker, but there was a bill passed about grooming. Grooming, for those who are not familiar, is the process of getting someone accustomed to abuse, so that when the abuse happens full out, the person doesn't ask for it to stop, doesn't ask for help, doesn't fight back, doesn't leave the situation. And most people that are trafficked are groomed. So there's a slow, steady process of breaking down their support system, breaking down their self-esteem, breaking down their boundaries, so that when this person experiences abuse, they are submitted to that situation. And a recent bill was passed to say that if we can prove that you were grooming to try to traffic someone, that was your intent, then now we can take some action. What are some of the specifics there?
Mhm. That's correct. And so so now here we would have to prove intent. If the end intent was to, traffic, then you could still be on the hook and liable for a trafficking offense. And actually, if we go to the definition of trafficking and we look at, harboring or transporting or soliciting, if it's sexual, if it's commercially sexual in nature, even if the person does not end up doing the thing that the trafficker wants them to do, that person doesn't end up in the doing the labor or doing the commercial sex act. If we can prove that the intent of the initial, the means of getting them there was to be trafficked, then we can still hook them for trafficking. Because we're, at that point, we're really getting down into the weeds of the law itself. We're breaking each word of the law down. And we're saying, well, this person, had you in the bedroom and wanted someone to come in there and, have sex with you so that they could get money, even if the other person didn't have sex with you, but that was the intent, then, if we could prove that intent, then the person would be able to get on the hook, would be on the hook for trafficking. So the grooming falls in line with that thought.
Yeah.
I'm not
So
gonna match that. That was great, Davina.
it was. So we share that just so that, again, as you're working with your clients, as you're listening to stories, that there are what's available to you, what options are available to you, so that this person can get help, be protected, whatever their fear, their concern is, knowing kind of what options are available can help you make sure that you're offering services as much as we can, right? The full spectrum of services available. Another arena that we see trafficking is a more international type, and that's in suspected or illegal massage businesses and in bars and cantinas. For both, it's a pretty similar story. These people were often promised a job, promised a way to come to the United States. Sometimes, especially in massage businesses, they came here legally. They had their papers in order. Some of them even got official training. But then when they arrive, their only contact is their employer. They are being compelled to provide sex acts to their customers. They might not receive payment. Oftentimes they are kept in the same facilities that they work in. So in a massage business, they stay there, they sleep there, and then sometimes they're rotated around between establishments. There can be a lot of, especially those that come from Asian cultures, there can be a lot of honor, shame type feelings. And so it can be very, very difficult for them to reach out to their home, their family. They don't want people to know what's happening to them. A lot of threats of harm to the family, threats of deportation. So these people are kept, if they did come and they had all their ducks in a row, their papers in order, well, then their paper expires or their visa expires, and then they're kept in this work environment, and now they can't leave, and now they're here legally, and so now they face this threat of deportation and punishment and jail. And these are very large sectors of trafficking that we see, especially here in Houston. It's been a few years, and so I don't know the update, but there was a report probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago that we have more suspected illegal massage businesses in Houston than we do Starbucks. So this is an extremely, and I think that Houston actually, unfortunately, boasts the largest concentration in the state, if not the country. So we have a large issue with this here. And so those are kind of the 3 areas that we see a lot of sex trafficking in Texas. And then again, service jobs where labor trafficking happens. This could be restaurants, hotels, construction, agriculture. Even in these areas like bars and cantinas or massage parlors, they might be asked to provide sexual services, but they're also serving drinks, giving massages, doing work. And so there we see that overlap there. So those are a few of the arenas that we see. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Just one of the things, like when we look at legal protections or legal options outside of just like the prosecution of traffickers, when we talk about these like bars and cantinas, like Christa's mentioning, one of the things that I think is really important is like TABC, for example, the Texas Alcohol Beverage Commission. That seems right. TABC is a part of this conversation. They have their own human trafficking initiative. They're a part of a lot of the task forces. A lot of our organizations work really closely with them, because where we might not have all of the information that we need to go after the trafficker, one of the things that, backdoor ways that we might try to do it is if it's an establishment like a bar or a cantina, then the TABC can actually come in and take away their liquor license or take away their alcohol license. And so then in means of doing that, what we're also trying to do is identify survivors that are intersecting in those different arenas and make sure that they are also set up with services. And so like at TABC, for example, they have an entire victim advocate now that is making connection with the survivors of human trafficking who are working within those different arenas and making sure that they have long-term safety and stability and resources and connection with agencies that continue to serve them. So like when we look at the holistic view of what are the different ways that other organizations are trying to impact this, that's one of the other organizations that we've been working with and trying to provide resources to as well.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I just want to make this little also along with what you're saying, Amanda. Landlords are another kind of big resource. Also, they could be culprits if they're allowing trafficking to occur in the spaces that they're renting or leasing out. And so we do see where, we're able to go after landlords and say, hey, well, you should have known that this was happening. You have control over this. You knew who you were taking money from. You're going to lose your license to be able to rent out this space. So there's a lot of different ways that we can try to have eyes. I mean, it's not that we're trying to watch everybody, that's not the goal, but the goal is to be able to catch these kind of acts and be able to help victims as much as possible. Yeah. And then I did want to mention, especially in the international arena, when we're talking about things like visas, there are certain fiancé visas, marriage visas, and then work visas, whether it's entertainment. So that can be used, like my brother plays basketball overseas. So he usually needs an entertainment visa to be able to do that overseas. But we've seen where people have used that to traffic their victims. And we've also seen, H1 visas, H1B visas, or the ones for like nannies and domestic servants, where that can also create a kind of cesspool for trafficking, especially in the forced labor field. And the reason why some of these visas, they're very important for people to be able to work in other places and be able to obtain some opportunities. But we do know that there are some dangers because the visas, having that visa is directly tied to one employer for the most part. And so when an employer is able to renew it or doesn't renew it, then that's a way we know that they can use to control their employees.
Yeah, that's so helpful, especially for those of you that are working with people coming from other countries and they've got that visa story. Nannies and domestic servants, servitude, that field, again, very prone to trafficking situations. So we've had case after case after case for decades in Texas, and we didn't have any real data until the University of Texas released the Texas Mapping Project. This study came out in 2016. And it was just our first look really at numbers in Texas on a large scale. We know that this isn't fully, this isn't the full picture. They even missed a large chunk of the population as they were looking at trafficking. So it's bare bones, but it's what we've got to work with. So if you haven't heard the study, they found that there were about an estimated 313,000 people being trafficked just in Texas. Of those, 234 were people being labor trafficked, and 79,000 were youth and minors experiencing sex trafficking. And for this study, that meant those that were 25 years old and younger. This study did not look at adults who are being trafficked for sex. So again, we're already missing like a very large chunk of the population. But it just kind of gives us at least some idea of the scope of what we're working with. And so as you are connecting with your clients, looking for who's doing what in this space, Texas is full of individuals, organizations, and agencies actively working to combat human trafficking, and there are so many supports available. The Office of the Governor has a child sex trafficking team that's building care coordinations in every county. I call them like a team of Avengers. So it's like a selected, appointed group of people that come together when a minor is identified as having been trafficked in a state in a county to get that minor services and make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. And so the Office of the Governor is working to establish those in literally every county. So everybody across Texas knows exactly who to call, knows exactly the protocol to follow. But across Texas and here in the Houston area, we have coalitions and task forces, United Against Human Trafficking. We have HATRA, Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance, which is a blend of service providers and law enforcement. And we have some statewide task forces as well. And then so many nonprofits like TAP, Lone Star Legal Aid, and Micreate. And again, just countless resources. And the coalition is a great place to tap into those nonprofits that are already doing something. And so the more that you can just send emails, get lunch with people, make those face-to-face connections and build relationships, people will know what service you provide, what kind of piece of the pie you take, and where you can reach out to for the different things that you need. Right, have we covered here? Sweet. Oh, where's my mouse? You know, when you work on too many screens. And so Davina's going to walk us through some international definitions and help us kind of understand where the US fits in the grand scheme of things.
Yes. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information on some of the international standards on trafficking. Most of this is going to be based off of the United Nations. And just for a basis, the United Nations is an organization that is made up of a lot of different countries, I believe 180 at least. So most of the countries in the world where they agree, they make treaties, they make alignments to talk about different international things, essentially. A lot of it focuses on human rights, and human trafficking is one of the things that the UN does focus on. And so first, I do want to show that the types of trafficking that are recognized on an international level, many of them are the same. So there's, sexual exploitation, debt bondage, servitude. And then some of it, this is where we start to kind of diverge a little bit, where we see forced marriage of children and adults recognized internationally as a form of trafficking, forced begging. Now, when we do talk about forced begging, if we see something like that here in the US, we, through the way that the laws are written, we can still be able to say, oh, that's forced labor. But internationally, when we're talking about forced begging, there's a whole world out there where people are collecting children and, kind of like the Slumdog Millionaire, that's very extreme, where they're maiming them and forcing them to beg. That's very extreme. But we do see where they are forcing, children or women and men to beg and collecting the money and then kind of requiring them to keep on making more and more and more. And so that's just recognized internationally. Child soldiering is, and children that are involved in armed conflict is a major one right now. And actually looking at, and I'm not going to share my screen here, but looking at the call for inputs for the new report for the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking and Slavery, they're actually focusing a lot on redefining and kind of updating their definitions around child soldiers. Before, at one point, child soldiers, I think the age was 15. And through some of the protocols and treaties that the UN has made, they raised that age to 18. But we can see that in armed conflict around the world, there is a lot of there are a lot of countries that are using children under the age of 18 to be able to do, things that really only adults should be doing in armed conflict. We also see where forced labor in prisons is a major one. This is something that they identify as forced labor, and they'll add it to their numbers when we're looking at international standards, as well as, and I don't think I put it here, but forced labor of prisoners of war, which is something that I worked on when I was interning with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I was obsessed with having the ICTY to aggravate sentences if there was any form of labor or sex trafficking that was forced on prisoners by a international criminal war person. And so that is also another thing that we're seeing the international world take a little bit more care at looking at. Here you also see where there's illegal adoptions, which we would also restate as the sale of children. And so if it's, a way, if someone is going about obtaining a child that may not be theirs outside of the streams that we have in place in the world, then we would generally call that illegal adoptions, and that is considered trafficking. And then lastly, illegal enforced organ removal. Usually this would be for two reasons. For a very small subset of cultures out there, it would be to use the organs for some type of ceremony. But for the most part, it would be for things like, someone needs a heart. So we're going to take somebody, cut out their heart, or they've agreed. Well, usually it's forced, or they've agreed to sell their heart, and then they're going to use that heart and implant it into somebody else who needs it. And so that's what we're talking about. It's illegal, of course, that's a crime, but internationally we do recognize that as trafficking. A lot of the definitions are very much the same when it comes to what is trafficking, but trafficking in persons, they do expand it. And so the long definition is that it's the recruitment, transportation, transfer, the harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, which is really important, or of a position of a vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. And I'll stop it there because it's a lot. There's a lot more. But here they really did try to spell out what is coercion. They included abduction. They did include the abuse of power, because we do see where people utilize that abuse of power. If we think of a family structure, you have your parents and you're supposed to do what your parents say. So if they tell you you have to go sell drugs, then you're probably likely, to do that. Here, I do believe, I know that they do mean more so like, people of power, like presidents and ambassadors and things like that, who are using their position in order to force somebody to do something else. Many of the other definitions are the same as what Amanda already talked about, so I won't go through that too much. I do want to just let you know that in terms of international standards, the Office for the, oh my goodness, there we go. The Office of the High Commissioner, they usually do all the human rights things. And so they're the ones where the protocol is housed. The US is a signatory to the protocol. And thank you. The U.S. is a signatory to the protocol, as well as things like the Geneva, as well as to the different treaties, the different protocols, some of which have, so we have there we go. So one of the most important pieces of international legislation is the Geneva Conventions of 1949, where they start to recognize forced labor in prisons. We've got the Rome Statute, where the U.S. is a signatory, but we didn't ratify it and we don't really follow it anymore. But this is where folks can be held accountable in international crimes or international court. And then we've got a few other conventions that talk about child pornography, using children as slave labor, and a whole host of other conventions that talk to different crimes with children in the armed conflict as well. So just wanted to give that, and I'll give this last story and then we can move on. One of the things, why this affects me and has affected me in the past, and as I was telling you, Christa and Amanda before, was I have had potential applicants come to my office and say, hey, I was illegally sold as a child. Can you take my case? And because the way the US defines trafficking and the fact that it doesn't necessarily, it's not exactly the same as international standards, we were not able to take the case because a lot of grants in the US are based off of the US standards. And so, you know, whereas I did recognize the person as a trafficking victim, we weren't able to provide service because there were certain limitations that we had. I would like you to know that, you know, organizations like TAP, they may not have as many restrictions because of how, you know, their structures are written out. And so sometimes it doesn't mean that the person can't get help. No, we're definitely going to find a person help who may not always fit into our mold, but they're able to fit into someone else's mold. So just wanted to give that little tidbit, and I'm done.
Was beautiful. Thank you. And just, again, helpful to understand how globally we see trafficking and how it compares to the US, so that as we are working with people that do come from other countries, there might be, you know, other opportunities, other resources that we could refer them to get them the services they need. So as the three of us were discussing, you know, talking about human trafficking, we recognize that in this field, we throw out a lot of big words, and or just not even big words, just words that you're just like that. But what does that mean? Like, what does that practically look like? To say that human trafficking is, you know, inducing someone into commercial sex through forced fraud and coercion really rolls off the tongue when you've been doing this for 10 years. But it makes no sense. So we want to just kind of take some time to really unpack, like, what do we mean by force, fraud, and coercion? They are so essential to defining a trafficking case. What does it look like? Just kind of expounding and kind of camping here on, let's just make things clear. So if you've come to this point in the presentation and you are like, excuse me, I'm still lost, or you just have questions in general, this would be a great time to throw them in the chat. We'll definitely do some Q&A at the end, so please throw all your questions out there. We want to get to them. But this is the part where we really want to break down and simplify what we've been talking about. So Amanda, could you start us off just by like really straightforward force, fraud, and coercion? What does it look like? How does that fit into the big picture?
Yes, I just struggled with a moment for what screen am I on? Where is my how do I unmute myself? Okay, thank you so much, Christa. And I kind of want to throw it back to y'all for a moment. If you're in a space, it's safe. Please, if you're driving, please do not be using the chat right now. Safety planning is first. But I'd like to kind of throw it back to the audience for a moment. And when we say the words force in the framework of trafficking, what does that look like to y'all? When you hear the word force, how have you seen that with survivors that you've worked with? How have they identified force? And I'm going to give a minute for some people to kind of like pop in there. And then I think we can like fill it in as well. But when you hear the word force, what do you think that means? Manipulation. Okay. Thank you, Marcella. You're the first one. Anybody else? Force. So I started this work 18 years ago, working with survivors of different types of gender-based abuse. But 18 years ago, we didn't really have shelters specifically for human trafficking survivors. And I worked at a domestic violence and sexual assault shelter at the time. And so a lot of like my foundational information and work in this space and in this movement is working with victims of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And so when I say the word force to a survivor, that might mean physical force, right? That might mean I've had survivors before who said, oh, well, they never hit me. And I said, okay, well, have they ever like pinned you up against a wall? Have they ever, kept you locked up in a room and you weren't allowed to get out and they locked the door behind them and then now you're, stuck in this room? Have they ever hit their fist next to your head by a wall and punched a hole in the wall? And so these are like ways that I would help a survivor identify how force, how abuse might look like in their situation. And so I think, one of the things that we all want to be really cognizant of, and I know that Christa has another slide on in a moment, is like, we don't want to re-traumatize survivors. So we don't want to ask a lot of questions. We'll like have a checklist of like, did you experience physical abuse? Did they ever, force you to have sex with somebody against your will? Or did they not allow you to take birth control? Did they lie about their birth control? Like you could have all these questions on a checklist, but that can feel really triggering for a survivor. And so having it be more conversational, and then as the conversation is going, then you can be like writing down little notes of like, oh, okay, I'm hearing these different types of force, of fraud, or of coercion. So like real quickly, I'm going to kind of like, I have a list that I kind of am looking at in my head as I'm listening to survivors and their stories. But when we talk about force, like I said earlier, we can talk about like physical force. We can talk about like restraining somebody. We can talk about sexual assault, like very specifically. We can talk about domestic violence, intimidation by causing or threatening physical harm with the presence of a weapon. So we know like weapon brandishing, like sometimes that might even look like, I worked with a survivor one time who said every day when she came home, her abuser had a firearm that was fully loaded and the safety was off and it sat on a nightstand. And the only way that she knew that something was wrong or was off is because the firearm was not there one day. And she was able to get out of the house and she came into the shelter that I was working at the time. And that's a long story. He's in jail. But that her recognizing that one thing saved her life. Inflicting violence on a victim's children or pets. Pets are oftentimes a barrier for survivors in leaving, just like children are. And so when we look at asking questions, that's a good question to ask. Have you ever separated from this person before? What's worked? What hasn't worked? Are there reasons that you felt like you needed to go back into that space? And that's where you're going to hear those types of things. Well, he had my dog and he wouldn't let me take my dog with me. And that dog has been with me for the past 10 years and it's my comfort. So you'll hear these types of things. Threatening to kill family members or friends or pets again. So there's lots of different things when we look at force, that force can be considered. Is there anything, Davina and Christa, that you guys wanted to add to that?
No, you did a good job of, thank you so much for the examples, just showing that it may not be, being hit every day, but there's different ways that we can experience force. And I'm just so happy legislation has recognized that. So.
Yeah. I think one thing that sometimes is really hard for us in this space is when we see survivors who are experiencing substance abuse issues or mental health issues and trying to navigate different resources available for them. But you know, it's like the chicken or the egg. We know that abusers are preying on victims with vulnerabilities, and the use of drugs and alcohol in those relationships helps keep victims in those relationships. So either like giving a victim of human trafficking drugs and supplying them with drugs, that can keep a survivor in a relationship, because they have to, like, medically they need to like fill that need, or else they'll have detox, and that can be life-threatening for many survivors. And then, you know, we also see the withholding, right? And so if you don't do this one thing for me, then you don't get this, whatever it is, you know, fill in the blank. And so that force can look like lots of different things, even if it's not that physical use of force. It can be restricting somebody's access to their friends, to their network, to their family members, restricting or giving them, you know, different substances or alcohol or things like that. Do you want me to move on to fraud, Christa?
Yeah, I was going to ask, you know, would force also be, you know, drugging someone or forcing them, exacerbating their addiction, or even something like, I don't know where you kind of classify this, but like withholding someone's documents.
Mm-hmm.
So
Good.
keeping their passport, things like that.
Absolutely. And so that can actually, in my opinion, but I'm not the attorney here, Davina is, that can fit under two categories for me, is the force and the fraud piece, right? So like you say, like if you're going to withhold somebody's documents unless they do this, or for this period of time while they're doing this certain project, which ends up continuously getting extended, right? Oh, the project's not complete. You forgot to do this one thing. And so I'll give you your documents, or I'll sign that paper so that you can get your documents once you complete this task. So I see that in a lot of different categories on this page right here, which would be like the coercion piece, the fraud piece, and the force piece.
Yeah. Thanks. So yeah, tell us about fraud. What do we see there?
So fraud, you kind of just talked a little bit about the withholding of somebody's documents, but things that I'm listening for when it comes to fraud. One thing that you mentioned earlier, Christa, is, you know, technology can be such a great tool for so many people, right? Social media can be such a great tool for so many people. I like to give this little caveat in a lot of my trainings that if you're on TikTok, I'm sorry, but like your algorithm is going to be super messed up by the end of this presentation, okay? Because of the work and the nature of the work that we do, you're just inherently going to start getting a lot of these different types of things up on your feed now. So with the use of technology and with the use of social media platforms where they can be used as tools, they can also be used as weapons, right? And we see that victims of human trafficking, and really lots of different types of violence, but specifically human trafficking, where we're looking for those, not we, the traffickers, are looking for vulnerabilities, right? So there's keywords or key phrases that they might be using. If you've anybody on this call, if you've never received a training from oh Jesus, what's the name? It just literally, NCMEC, the National Center Missing and Exploited Children. There it is. NCMEC, they have phenomenal trainings around the different types of tactics that are used, the keywords, the pictures, the tattoos. I learn something new every single time I go to one of their trainings. So if you need a connection or with somebody from NCMEC, please let us know. I'm sure that one of us on this call has some great contacts with them. But let me just give you like the quick things that I'm looking at or listening for when I'm talking to a survivor around fraud. So deception by the trafficker intended to result in the trafficker's financial or personal gain. So what could that include? Like something like, if you do this for me, this service for me, if you go and meet this person for dinner, then I will, you know, give you a place to stay for the night. But like the personal gain in that is that there's actually monetary, you know, gain for that trafficker. Christa gave a great example of that earlier when we talked about like familial trafficking. Deception by making false promises, unjustifiable claims, or lying about their accomplishments or credentials. I know that this is a hot topic for a lot of people and a lot of people are talking about it, but like the Jeffrey Epstein thing, like if you, one of the first things that you hear about Jeffrey Epstein, he lied about all of his credentials. He had no degree, but he was able to like elevate himself into this prominent space, right? So like that's a key thing to kind of like really look into. That's why like for all my friends who are online dating right now, I'm like, let's search them. Like we're doing all the background checks. Oh, you said you went to this school. Like I'm about to check the records of that school. Like we're going deep into it. Establishing false sense of credibility or security, creating fake business deals or ventures. Davina is in with her own nonprofit is a genius. I have utilized her services multiple times. I'm like, please help me with this contract that the survivor is being asked to sign. So that they can go speak at this event. I don't want for them to sign anything that they do not feel comfortable signing, because it's possible that they've had to sign documents before, or that they've been put under contract before and they didn't understand what the words were in these contracts that they were signing, and now they're tied to them and they're legally bound to them, right? And so then again, when we look at that power and control, it's like that use of that coercive coercion and fraud to keep somebody in that life. You want to add anything to that one, Davina?
So I like to say fraud is a switch and bait. And it's really where, you think you're coming into one thing because someone you felt like you could trust told you this is how it's going to be. You get in there and then it's like something completely different. And so, yeah, fraud, we usually see it at the point of recruitment and when trying to keep somebody on to, as you said, Amanda, like a project. Oh, well, if you just keep working for me, then yeah, I'll make sure that you get, a better place. And then that better place never comes. Well, that's deception. That's fraud. Or if you come work for me in my restaurant, then you'll be able to get paid $15 an hour. Well, I come to your restaurant and your restaurant turns into a cantina at night. And now I'm forced to, have sex with men, sell drinks to men and dance and do all these other things. And so that's what I like to call it, a switch or bait. It's bait and switch. Oh, the bait and switch. Yeah, bait and switch.
I feel like it works both ways. Maybe not. I love the simplified way of looking at that.
Yeah.
Of looking at fraud.
One of the things that I try to highlight is that, these elements of forced fraud and coercion are, again, part of that story. How did someone end up in this situation where they are working or engaging in commercial sex? And these are the control tactics that the law kind of outlines that tells us you didn't really sign up for this. You wouldn't, this wasn't fully your autonomous choice. However, and Amanda hit on this earlier, most people are being trafficked, don't identify as having been trafficked. And it's often because of this fraud piece. Because when we think about control, we tend to think about force and that physical element. And so that's why I don't like the phrase forced into prostitution, because it paints a picture in our mind that just isn't accurate. It just isn't what we see all the time. And so we don't often think about fraud as a means of control. But think about it this way. Most of us are working and getting paid every 2 weeks-ish, right? We're not getting, we're not having pennies or dimes or quarters, haven't done the math, rolling into our bank account every single second that we're on the job. You showed up to work today because you believe that in 2 weeks or a week or whatever, you're going to get a paycheck. Your belief informed your action. So if I want to control you, I don't need to control what you physically do. I need to control what you believe. But the tricky part about that is that you don't necessarily know that that's what I'm doing. And so when you begin to act on your belief, you feel like you are making these choices, that you showed up to that photo shoot. You said, okay, I'll sleep with this guy if, it'll take care of this debt you owe him. Like you feel like you've made choices. And so what happens is when people land in these situations, especially young people, especially kids, they land in these situations and they look back and they say, well, I did sneak out. I did lie to my parents. I did take that drug. I did send that picture. So I guess this is just what happens to me.
Mhm.
And the question we need to be asking is, who asked you to sneak out? Who asked you for that picture? Who offered you that drug? Because there's usually someone else in trafficking, there's usually someone else who made that option available to you, who spun the story in a certain way. And so fraud is this element, right, where we're not just, we're buying into a story. They're spinning a story and the person buys into it. And then you don't just buy into the story or the situation, you buy into the storyteller. You buy into this person who came and offered you that chance to get into your dream school or to be a model like you've always wanted. You buy into this person who said they love you and we're going to take care of you and we're going to be your way out of the foster care system. Like they make it so that you want to buy into who they are. And then once you've bought into them and the relationship and what they're offering you, then all of a sudden there's all these strings attached. Then the relationship begins to fall apart. And that's where we see coercion come into how, again, that bait and switch. The fraud is that bait and kind of, I'm going to hook you in. And then the coercion is how I'm going to manipulate you once I've got you there. So I'd love to, Amanda, hear, your thoughts on coercion and how that all really comes out in the wash.
For sure. And I know that y'all are definitely going to have some things to add here. I think, one of the things that's really important while we're doing this work, again, going back to those definitions, how do we define coercion in Texas? How do we define coercion federally? How does the international standards identify coercion? The fact that the international standards have, I just want to clap and praise everything in this world that they have added the use of power to those coercive tactics. That's my dream, we have pieces of that in our coercion legislation in Texas, but it's so specific in how Texas defines coercion. And we know that coercive tactics are so broad and they're really hard to identify for a lot of survivors. And, it goes back to a lot of times when I'm working with youth, and Christa, you might have this experience too, is, man, when I was in high school, if somebody would have used the word gaslighting, I don't think that I would have understood what that meant. I'd probably have to go Google it or go to that website, Urban Dictionary, and what is gaslighting? I'd probably have to go and actually try to figure that out. But it's such a common term in vernacular today, and how people identify different things in relationships, which is great, right? I love that. But I also want for people to understand what that word actually means. And it's the same thing with coercion. What is coercion and how can we help survivors identify what are all those layers looking like? So some of the quick ones, we talked about grooming earlier. Grooming is so difficult for people to identify, because it's this systematic stripping of somebody's autonomy and agency, right? And it's the manipulation tactics that are used within that grooming that happen. And the grooming isn't just happening to one person, it's probably happening to a lot of people in that person's life. So, oh, it's okay that my daughter goes, to the, gymnastics with this person because I trust this person, because they've, whittled their way into my life for me to feel like I can trust them because they've put up this fake facade of who they actually are so that they can build the trust to then use that trust against them, and victimize people. So coercion, let me think of some ones that I want to use. Isolation can be part of coercion. Moving people out into rural areas, especially here in Texas, that isolation tactic and can be very difficult for a lot of survivors. trauma bonding. That's another like these like buzzwords that people talk about now. I told you your TikTok's going to be all messed up, so you're welcome. Brainwashing, blaming, normalizing, their like harmful behaviors, trying to like really say like, oh, this is what love is supposed to look like, or this is how somebody is a boss. Like you've never had a boss before, you've never had a supervisor before, but this is what supervisors do, and really exploiting those vulnerabilities of survivors. Coercion with the use of substance abuse and the use of different substances, making false promises. So I like to talk about this, like, I know we have like 10 minutes left, that we have this like Maslow's hierarchy of need, right? And a lot of times whenever we're doing this work in this space, I talk about how amazing it is for a survivor to receive a legal consult from an attorney. But the reality is if their basic needs aren't even being met, then all of that amazing information that an attorney is giving them is going in one ear and out the other because of the trauma that they're experiencing and because of the state of crisis that they're in. So it's really important. This is why we brought social workers on at Texas Advocacy Project to provide that holistic services. Let's get this survivor the basic needs. Does their child have diapers and formula? Do they have a safe place to stay? Like, do they have working, in the middle of summer, electricity and, an AC unit or a heating unit whenever it's one time a year, 20 degrees outside? Like, are their basic needs being met? Well, we're asking that. You know who else is asking that? Traffickers, right? If I can say that I'm meeting your basic needs through these coercive tactics, through that bait and switch, like they talked about earlier, then I'm going to be able to keep you in these different dynamics of relationships or in working relationships for longer because you're getting a need met, one of your basic needs met.
Yeah.
I would also like to just quickly add that a major one, is cultural coercion. So not just like tied to ethnicity or nationality, but also culture within a home. Now, in terms of tied to ethnicity and nationality and things like that, I was raised in a Nigerian household. And so there's a lot of things that I can tell you culturally that goes on. But when we're looking at culture, there's sometimes, if we're talking about international folks coming into the US or someone from the US going somewhere else, automatically there likely is a language barrier. And so we just automatically from the get-go cannot communicate. And it goes to what Amanda was saying about isolation. Also just cultural experiences. I've had clients who were like, well, they were giving me a better life. And so, yes, I just went along with it because otherwise I'd be in X, Y, and Z country where I'm being hunted down, and so that is also coercive. If the person knows that they're taking advantage of somebody else's situation, majorly coercive, especially when that situation looks, right, quote unquote, looks worse than their current situation, even though their current situation may be horrible. And so I think that that's a major one. And when we're talking about the culture of like a home, Christa mentioned it earlier, this is just what happens in our family. This is just expected. And I'm supposed to give back, or my best friend helped me. Of course, I'm going to help my best friend. Why wouldn't I do that? They helped me. Now I'm going to be a help to them. So yeah, I'll sleep with everybody that they tell me to sleep with because they're giving me a place to live. So the culture of things is a major, major hold on people. I think more than we give credit to on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute basis. Just wanted to put that out.
Yeah, that's so helpful. So as we kind of wrap up, we wanted to just kind of highlight again what this looks like practically, to be able to see that anytime that we're engaging with someone and we're hearing these abusive tactics, and oftentimes that's what you're going to hear first. You're not always going to hear about the commercial sex or their bad job. You're going to hear or notice those relationship pieces. And so you want to be listening with that filter of, okay, this person sounds like they are being abusive, exploitative. We hear some coercion, some manipulation going on. Now I'm listening and I'm carefully asking questions around how that is being used? Is that being leveraged against this person in some way? And again, wanting to do that in a way that's not, triggering or getting them to uncover, really just slowly going at their pace, asking some questions, getting them to think through some things. We wanted to wrap up today just talking a little bit about some things to keep in mind as we work in this field. Human trafficking has become such a hot button issue. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's working on it. And I'm so thankful because we need literally everyone in this space. This is way too big of an issue for one organization to camp in and take it all. We all have to work together. And so but I've noticed, like I've been in this work for almost a decade, and human trafficking is kind of looked at as this social issue. And yes, it is. But social means people. Like this, at the end of the day, this is a people-rooted, people-centered story. And we want to walk in this space with, I almost just want to use the word reverence. Like we just want to be so cognizant that we are working with the treasure that is people's lives and their story, and be sure that we are holding that in a really respectful way. And for those of us that are advocates or allies in this work that maybe don't have lived experience, just keeping that in mind, that individual people are at the heart of this issue. And so first, we want to make sure that we are being inclusive, especially of those with lived experience. For those of us, again, it's easy to learn about trafficking and then want to take action. And like, that's beautiful, yes. And we need to be partnering with and empowering and uplifting those that have walked through this themselves. This is their story. Something that I say a lot is, especially when it comes to the online piece, like survivors over social media. People, it's very easy to share that triggering post about the creepers in the Walmart parking lot that you knew were sex traffickers. And, we see those posts go around social media all the time. But can we be lifting up survivor voices, including them in our work, not just saying, oh, hey, we made this program, what do you think? But saying, hey, what are the needs that you see? What would have been a benefit to you to prevent this or to help you when you were getting out? How do you think we should build that? How do you think we should market it? And then paying and compensating them for their time, their work, their inclusion, and not just expecting them to give those things for free, because I wouldn't, I get paid for my job. Otherwise, now we're talking about trafficking. So we have to be careful about even just re-exploitation of people in this work. And making sure that, again, we're being inclusive of people lived experience, of people that come from marginalized communities or that have been affected by these intersectional pieces we're talking about. Listening to their stories, asking for their voices, lifting up their voices wherever we can. And then just watching our language, you'll notice that as we talked today, you didn't hear, we use the word victim in some like legal context, but we're not calling them victims as a label. And we want to be very careful that we are using people first language, not because it's politically correct or because it like makes us sound better, but because we have to be so intentional about humanizing each other. It's human nature to dehumanize other people. So we have to be intentional about it and using people first language and saying things like people with lived experience, people who have been trafficked on a subconscious level reminds us that we are dealing with precious people with human lives. And it keeps us connected to that. It also makes sure that the people who have been through those things are not hearing themselves labeled or categorized by someone else. Nobody likes to feel that way. And so we want to be cautious about the words that we use and why we use them. And then just noticing how we position ourselves in this work. Are we positioning ourselves as experts or saviors or heroes? Or are we really just saying, hey, these people that have suffered and have been marginalized belong in this world just like I do, and I'm going to move aside, do what I need to do to lift them up, to stand right next to me. And again, it's really subtle. It's those like internal, mostly heart kind of stuff. But it comes out in the programs we make and the legislation we advocate for. It comes out in the words that we use. And so we have to kind of check, we got to check ourselves a little bit and make sure that all of our efforts are focused on empowering the people that we serve, that we're not perpetuating that narrative that they need someone else to fix their problems, because that's often what got them in these exploitative situations. We need to be focusing our efforts on empowering them, on reminding them of their inherent dignity, of their worth and belonging. And that comes down even in the way that we market, the pictures we use, the words we use. We don't want to be showing them as weak or helpless, or we want to be picturing them as capable and able and worthy and very normal, like you or me, because they're humans, they're just like us. So we just have to kind of be careful that we position ourselves not as the heroes or the saviors, or that we're not dehumanizing them, even in an accidental kind of way. And so I know that those that come into this work are here because you care and here because you're passionate. These are just lessons I've had to learn the hard way by being like, oh yeah, that would make me uncomfortable if this situation was reversed. Like I need to stop using that word. I need to stop using that phrase or that picture. And just kind of really putting myself in their shoes, or just listening to them in the first place. That helps. So those are just some tidbits that as we work in this space together, I think we're going to be incredibly powerful with this information and these values kind of in play. You have anything to add to that?
You got it perfectly. Yeah.
Mic drop. I'm like, yes.
All the snaps. Well, we want to thank you. This is us. So Amanda with Texas Advocacy Project, Davina with Micreate, but also with Lone Star Legal Aid. And then I'm Christa with Project Protect Our Children. And again, we're all here to work in this space to advocate for people that have experienced this, to prevent it before it happens. And so whatever we can do to serve you, to help come alongside you, all of us here are committed to collaboration. We believe in it so much. So we would love to connect with you. Do you have any closing comments?
I'm just so grateful for the time. I know that, sometimes when we do these trainings, and we attend trainings, we're like, okay, is there new information that I'm going to learn today? And every single time that I'm share space with Christa and Davina, I learn new things, and I'm grateful for that opportunity, even for myself. And so I hope that everybody on today's call, that y'all were able to get resources or some clarity around things. And we are all a resource for you. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We would love to be able to partner with you and help you and help survivors.
And I just want to thank you all so much for joining, and thank you for asking your questions. And as Amanda said and Christa said, feel free to reach out to us. We are real people. We're here. We can answer your questions. We're happy to have conversations with you. And we love to meet folks. So yeah.